Hi, everyone. My name is Mac, and I will be presenting with my partners Alwyn and Amal. And we're doing our presentation on Vodafone in Egypt surrounding the national crisis and their implications for multinational corporations. So, in January of 2011, Egyptians had become frustrated with the government and especially the president, President Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak had been serving a basically indefinite term because at the time there was no limitations to how long the president could serve. And he had also placed Egypt in a state of emergency for many years, which had given him essentially unchecked political power. As a result of this political power that Mubarak garnered in Egypt, there was a lack of human rights, prohibited street demonstrations, limits on political organization, candidate bans in elections, and imprisonment of individuals without reason, which could potentially be indefinite. It was noted that between 5 and 10,000 people were held in long-term detention without charges or trial as a result of emergency law. Additionally, police brutality was rampant, and it was noted that 567 documented cases of torture, which resulted in 167 deaths, were recorded between 1993 and 2007. So, despite people's vast, unhappiness and resentment towards Mubarak and the government, Mubarak was actually seen as a political ally to the West and Western countries because he had opened up the Egyptian economy and was less, hostile towards Western countries than other Middle Eastern countries at the time. And Mubarak, in his last term, had aggressively pursued economic reforms to attract foreign investment and facilitate GDP growth. And he was successful in this. Egypt was sort of booming in the sense of GDP growth, and they had also the lowest unemployment rate, or one of the lower unemployment rates. They had a lower unemployment rate than the United States and the European Union at the time. However, there had been socio-political damage done to the people of Egypt, and despite this low unemployment, people were unhappy across the board. Labor unions became more aggressive, demanding more rights for workers and better wages. And one of the main groups that were really dissatisfied were educated Egyptians. People who actually had degrees were the biggest group of unemployed people. Out of all the unemployed people, 80% of these people were highly educated. So as a result of people's unhappiness, they started to take to the streets to protest, and they facilitated these protests through things like social media, like Facebook and Twitter. Mubarak saw this as a direct threat to his political power and decided to ban Twitter the day the protests were set to take place, which was January 25th. And then 2 days later, he had banned Facebook, which obviously was a big hit to the protesters because social media, as we all know, is so effective and paramount in all our lives today. So to be able to coordinate mass amounts of people, for example, one of the Facebook groups organizing the protests had 80,000 members. So this was a huge movement, and for the president to ban it, it obviously became difficult to facilitate protests and things like that. Additionally, Mubarak instructed the multinational big corporations, the telecommunication companies like Vodafone, to send propaganda texts to the civilians of Egypt and the people who subscribe to these companies, basically saying that the Egyptian army was on their side, not against them, and that the government had their best interest in mind, which people knew wasn't true, and they saw it for what it was, which was propaganda. So Vodafone, before they had moved into Egypt, they date back to 1982 when they were called Rascal Strategic Radio, and they were a subsidiary of Rascal Electronics, a UK company. At this time, they were actually the largest maker of military radio tech. in the UK. In 1985, they launched their first office in Newbury, Berkshire. And come 1991, Rascal Telecom demerged from Rascal Electronics as the Vodafone Group. In 1997, Vodafone had acquired a new CEO. His name was Sir Christopher Gent. And Christopher Gent really transformed Vodafone from a small UK operator to a global giant through international mergers and acquisitions. And these acquisitions were really the hallmark of Vodafone's success. And like many other companies that we know, through mergers and acquisitions, they can really increase their capital, their reach, and just overall access to different markets and information and technology. In 1998, Vodafone expanded into Egypt and acquired AirTouch Communications Incorporated for about $75 billion. And in 1999, the largest merger at the time took place between Mansman and Vodafone for $185 billion. Mansman was actually a company that owned Germany's largest mobile market, and Vodafone had acquired 35% of this company. So that gave them, again, more access to foreign markets, more capital, and was a really big opportunity for them. In 2003, Vodafone had started to withdraw from saturated and unprofitable markets. These markets included Sweden, Belgium, and Japan, and they started investing heavily in countries like India, Turkey, Romania. These markets were growing and not saturated, so they had a big opportunity to get a first mover advantage, expose themselves to customers who may not have had a cell phone or were looking to change things up, and essentially capture a larger market share than waste their time in companies that already had a high mobile penetration rate, that they were already happy with their service, or they weren't looking to change to a new foreign company that was just coming into the game. And on top of this, they had started to extend their product offerings to include internet, data, and broadband services. In 2010, some important developments happened. One important development was the fact that the National Telecommunication Regulatory Authority of Egypt announced plans for extension of the length of mobile numbers from 10 to 11 digits. So the 10-digit system was starting to reach capacity, and the system for it wasn't able to support more clientele. So by doing this and extending the number, of Vodafone and other companies were able to capture more customers, essentially increasing their revenues. And as of 2011, Vodafone had 341 million customers worldwide. They had equity interests in 30 countries and partner markets in 40 countries. And one of their biggest associates that I didn't realize was part of Vodafone was the Verizon wireless network in the United States. And here's just a little visual showing essentially the timeline of Vodafone's different mergers and acquisitions and hallmarks of the company that led to their success. So again, in 1982, they were awarded the UK's first mobile license. 1999, they merged with AirTouch Communications, creating the largest mobile business in the world, and that occurred in Egypt. They also formed Verizon Wireless with Vodafone and Bell Atlantic, and Vodafone had 45% of the stake in that in 1999. So again, that's access to a huge American market, leading to inevitable huge growth as well. And then in 2000, they acquired Mansman, which was, again, the largest merger at the time, $185 billion. And then 2007, they entered India's mobile market, and it just kept growing from there. So Vodafone Egypt, their market entry and development, again, this is just showing the different companies that they had acquired and their growth from when they first entered the market and to where they are today. As of 2010, they had employed 6,500 staff, speaking 10 different languages in 80 countries with a customer base of 24.6 million. So Vodafone had done a really great job of expanding their reach, joining different markets, and really focusing on the markets that had the most growth opportunity, like India, like Turkey, like Romania, among others. So that was really the hallmark to their success, was being able to commit and go through with different mergers and acquisitions. And lastly, for me, this is just a little map giving you further insight as to Vodafone's global reach. The dark red is their subsidiaries, and those include countries like Albania, Czech Republic, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, the Netherlands, Turkey, the UK, Egypt, India, and so on. Their joint ventures include Australia, Italy, and Fiji, and their associates, like I mentioned, was Verizon Wireless, and they also have another associate, Safaricom, in Kenya. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it on to Amal and Alwyn to talk about CSR and how social media influences mobile operators.
Thank you, Mackenzie, for your wonderful presentation. And now let's look on to Egypt's telecom market. That's our next topic. Before that, let's see some facts about Egypt. Egypt is a developing country ranking 116th on the Human Development Index. Politically, however, it is considered to be regional power in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Muslim world, and a middle power worldwide. Egypt has a diverse economy, which is the second largest in Africa, the third largest economy by nominal GDP, and the 20th largest globally by PPP. And the population of Egypt is really high. It's the 15th populated country in the world, and it is a good market for everything. Every every business firm are looking on to Egypt for entering into the market. Egypt is really a large market for telecommunication services. Currently, there are like four major cellular communication services: Orange, Vodafone, Etisalat, and V. So the major changes on the telecommunication field came after the year 1999. So before looking onto those events, we have to look onto the situations of Egypt before 1999. Actually, Egypt got the independence from Britain in the year 1952, and it was followed by Nasser regime, Sadr regime, and Mubarak regime, starting from 1981. The reign of Mubarak is the most notable one. So, Hosni Mubarak took on to the assumed the power of Egypt in the year 1981, and Egypt was facing a lot of problems, mainly the economic problems. So, once Hosni Mubarak entered into the power, he could not do anything with the economic problems of the country. But in his very first few speeches, Mubarak did frankly and prospectively identify Egypt's economic shortcomings. It was actually not a good start to Mubarak's reign. In the late 1980s, Egypt's economy suffered markedly from falling oil prices and was further weakened by a drop in the number of remittances from its 3 million workers abroad. In spite of rising debt burden, the government continued to rely heavily on foreign economic aid, leading to growing interference by the International Monetary Fund in Egypt's economic policies. In 1991, the Egyptian government signed the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program with IMF and the World Bank. The country's currency, the Egyptian pound, had to be devalued several times, interest rates were raised, and subsidies were lowered on food and fuel. And gradually, by the year 1991, the suppression of fundamentalism happened, and fundamentalism can be like simply defined as a type of conservative religious movement characterized by the advocacy of strict conformity to sacred texts. And gradually, Mubarak emerged as dictator of the country. Now let's have a look on to major events and years happened on Egypt's telecom market. By the year 1999, the liberalization of telecom industries happened. The history of Egyptian telecommunication falls into three periods: private sector development of the nascent sector until 1957, state monopoly from 1957 to 1997, and the gradual reform and liberalization thereafter. As in many other developing countries, four main types of reform measures were introduced. First one is the regulatory reform, the second public sector reform and market liberalization, and finally the private sector participation. And the explicit stipulation in the 1998 law that telecom regulatory authorities' responsibilities include the encouragement of investment on a non-monopolistic basis and the support of free competition amongst the foreign and national companies. And the next major event in the Egypt's telecom market is the ratification of Telecommunication Act by the year 2003. The new telecommunication regulation law in 2003 reinforced the novel concepts such as competition, prohibition of monopolistic practices, trust building between incumbent companies and new entrants to the telecom sector, and finally the gradual removal of barriers to entry. Enforcement of the law was entrusted to NTRA, which has authority to punish monopolistic practices through denying licensure. As a part of the liberalization, TRA granted cellular services license to Mobilil and Vodafone in 1998. Prior to 1998, Telecom Egypt was the only international voice service provider. From this year, its legal monopoly status in direct provision was terminated. However, under the WTO commitments, Telecom Egypt was given exclusive rights to provide cross-border transmission until 2005. So, any provider providing or receiving international call services had to run Telecom Egypt's international gateway and networks. And after 1998, after introduction of Mobilil and Vodafone, no monopoly status was granted to either company. In effect, the two companies stand to compete with fixed line incumbent Telecom Egypt. After a 10-year duopoly transition period, a third cellular operator, Etisalat Mosa, entered in the market in 2007, guaranteeing further liberalization of the cellular market in Egypt. In 2009, Vodafone captured the largest share of the international voice market, 51%. Vodafone links with Telecom Egypt, together with its business strategy, have apparently reinforced the company's increased international market share. Since all three providers remains in the market, they may be jointly charging a higher price than would prevail under fully competitive conditions. Vodafone is likely making supernormal profits, and others are able to cover the higher costs induced by the margin skews to which they are subjected. Hosni Mubarak's rule caused many changes to Egypt's economy, some in the positive way, some in the negative way. But by the year 2010, the educated unemployment fell to 80%, and the youth births declining, child mortality rate and population growth, and also police torture was at its peak, like 5,000 to 10,000 people held without charges, and also the per capita income of the country was as low as $6,393 compared to 11,131, which was before. By 2011, people were so tired of the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. There were retaliation of the people, demonstrations, social unrest, war, terrorist tendencies, and most of the educated class people were not satisfied with the ruling of Hosni Mubarak. And also, the human rights of the people of the Egypt were very minimal. They were not having any rights, or they were not having any minimum wages. They were struggling a lot, and also the country was getting into deep troubles in terms of economy. Majority of the population was living in the rural areas. There were nothing Hosni Mubarak could do to empower them. So that's why people and every class of men started to have a revolution to throw away Hosni Mubarak from the power. And by 2011, the revolution started and the reign of the Hosni Mubarak ended. So my friend Alvin will be talking more about that. Thank you.
Hello all, myself Alvin. So I am taking the last part of our presentation. So Egyptians marked the day 25th January 2011 as a day of revolt, which was already known as National Police Day, that witnessed mainly non-violent protest throughout Egypt. Demonstrations, marches, labor strikes, non-violent civil resistance, civil disobedience, were the main form of protest took by the protesters. The protests continued the next day too, spreading to the Suez region. They were planning to step up more massive rallies in more cities, including Cairo, on January 28th after the weekly prayers past noon. It was planned to gather tens of thousands of protesters as per the focus of the protest. Main demand of the protesters were limitation to the president's term and the termination of the emergency law. The law did not only restrict civil rights but also put pressure on the telecom operators in Egypt, including Vodafone Egypt. As a result of these mass protests took place in Egypt, there was a response from the side of government. Government ordered all the telecommunication companies to stop their operations because these protesters used telecommunication network such as Facebook and Twitter to communicate each other and to make organize large rallies. But after this, as a result of this government order, Vodafone ignored the government order because reputation and morals are more important than potential risk of losing the revenue and a market share. Next, we move to the role of social media and mobile operators. The protesters used popular internet-based social media networks such as Twitter and Facebook, provided technological platform that was critical for the protesters, which enabled them to communicate among themselves and with the larger masses to get them organized. Having a huge impact on people through the internet, telecommunication companies should consider factors such as reputation, morals, and human rights. A company having its business activities in any field should not become harmful towards the society, so that it should maintain its reputation and goodwill in a better manner. A telecommunication business which has its majority customers in the same country where it runs should protect the moral values of the same country. The telecommunication company or a social media platform should not encourage the activities or any movement which is against the human rights. On January 27, 2011, Vodafone, along with the other two key mobile operators in Egypt, was ordered to shut down the mobile network in specified areas. Later, it was also introduced by the Egyptian authorities to send propaganda SMS messages. The content of the message was meant to appeal to the patriotism of all Egyptians, imploring them not to side with the protesting forces, but rather with the forces such as the Egyptian army, which had Egypt's best interest at heart. It was already being rumored that during a protest of textile workers previously in April 2008 in the town of El Mahalla, the Egyptian government authorities had successfully carried out an experiment involving the use of provocative elements of SMS and internet services to spread false rumors that would eventually lead to chaos. The Egyptian government could not only monitor ICT activities, but it was also technologically in a position to disconnect the entire system possibly. In case of such a forced closure, restoration of services should have had to rely on the Egyptian authorities, and it was likely that the restoration would take much longer compared to a disconnection by the mobile operators themselves. The Vodafone Egypt didn't had any other option other than to shut down their business in Egypt. The government was forced to shut down their network, and Egyptian authorities had both law and might on their side to forcibly shut down the network themselves. Now we move to the case questions. There are 4 questions here. So first of all, we discuss the first 2 questions, like list of 5 alternatives and the reasons to select these alternatives. A firm functioning in a nation has to obey their commands, right? Vodafone had a majority of its customers in Egypt. During a crisis, the firm had to obey with the rules set by the state that was against the firm's interest. To cut the communication, Vodafone was asked to cut off its network to silence the mob and bring the problems to normal situation. So, operating and having majority of customers in Egypt, the firm had to comply with the rules of the nation. Alternative steps that the firm could have to taken are meeting with the state about the issue, demand a written statement from the state authorities, explain the circumstances to their users, making sure legal making sure legal explanations for suspending services, warning the customers. Well, if I was in the position of Hatem Dovidar as a CEO of Vodafone Egypt, I would I would take some of the actions like appointing of expert committee, um, taking some legal actions like after getting a legal advice from the lawyer and all, we can take some legal actions, right? Building a strategic management team, action plan needed to control, determining the ways of correction. And the last question, identify information or perspectives that you are missing. Whom would you talk to in order to get the information you're looking for? Uh, in a business, there are many people close to the business, like stakeholders. So, if the company needs to get some information or any kind of advice, or if they are seeking information, so they can approach to their stakeholders or to the other interested parties associated to the business. So here I would like to suggest uh, consumers, competitors, competitors like other telecommunication network businesses, politicians, Vodafone global board members or leaders, government officials of Egypt. So these are the uh, perspectives for whom I would like to suggest the company to seek informations. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.